All right, God damn it. Welcome to all you accursed. It's another episode of Curse of Politics, Canada's favorite political podcast. I don't have any data to back that up. I just feel that way about the podcast. I feel it because of comments on Apple Podcasts like this from BAS 1809. I love the chemistry between Jenni Byrne, Scott Reid, and David Herle. Some of the last pundits who can fight hard and then head off arm in arm to enjoy life and a few drinks. Of course, that's balanced by this one from Slow Listened. What's with the fast talking? Sounds like everyone drank too much coffee and I can't even understand half of what's being discussed. So whether you love us or hate us, or whether it's booze or coffee, Jenni, Scott, and I are being outed for always drinking, which is 100% accurate. All right, here's this week's show. We're going to do our own brief election post-mortem to assist the Conservative caucus with theirs later this week at their retreat. We'll talk truckers, grocery shelves, and inflation. Why are the Liberals so seemingly dismissive, and why are the Conservatives aligning themselves with unvaccinated truckers? Our cursed clipping this week is Susan Delacourte's piece on governing via talking points, slogans, and hashtags. And finally, we'll do our Hayus for the week. Stick around for that. And Gordon Pinsent. Jenni, Scott, how are you?
Hey, good, David. How are you doing?
You know, Jenni, I'm fucking awesome. I'm in a good mood.
Wow.
I just woke up. I'm in a good mood. And I don't care. Nothing's going to break it. The Canadians can lose 8-2 to Minnesota with 8 different people scoring against them. And it doesn't affect my mood. The Buffalo Bills can lose in a way that makes Saskatchewan Roughrider fans go, man, that's a heartbreaker. And that still doesn't affect me. People can attack my perfectly legitimate and sound point of view about meatloaf, and it's still not even going to affect my day. I'm in a good mood. I'm so excited, I just can't hide it.
Wow. Well, I'm in a different place. You two, thank God I'm here. Otherwise, I'd be floating around in a cloud of joy. No. I barely made it to the podcast today. Like driving around the streets of Toronto, the sort of death race that it is, where you're trying to navigate the side street, trying to get Ben to school this morning. I barely made it here in time. It's insane how bad people drive, and snow is everywhere, and people can't move, and then they don't get over, and all this. And it's like a time machine. It seemed to me like when I was a kid, my dad would drive in this big black Dodge, and there'd be like a 26er of rye, half drank underneath the front seat. And he'd have the window down the whole time, just his head out the window so he could scream it without break, just screaming, cocksucking sons of bitches, move over. And it's all I think about the whole time I'm driving now, as I feel like I'm in my dad's car in 1977. So I hate driving in the city.
Well, David, I can't believe you don't like meatloaf. Like, have you not listened to some of the best lyrics? Like some of the best lyrics in music history.
Jenni, on a hot summer's night, would you offer your throat to the wolf for the red roses?
Yes, I bet you say that to all the boys.
Oh, come on. Would he offer you his hunger? How do you not like that, David?
I dare anybody to sit down right now and listen to Bat Out of Hell, which is obviously his best album, from start to finish.
It's fantastic.
I
did that all weekend long.
I did.
It's unlistenable.
My sister and I do a mean Paradise by the Dashboard Light. Like, and my sister, she is much more outgoing than I am. Like, she'll get into it as the guy. Like, she'll like at the end when he's like, I can't take it any longer. She'll like get on her knees. Like it's like we've got it. We got a rhythm down.
Jim
I
Steinman.
don't deny that Paradise by the Dashboard Light is a iconic song, and I can personally sing most of the lyrics against my will. But one novelty song does not a career make.
Bat Out of Hell is great. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Do you have no beating heart within your chest, man? I mean, my God. Baby, we can cry all night. We can talk all night. But that ain't getting us nowhere. David, you've never had a night like that?
Because I don't love you. That's not a love song. A love song doesn't have I don't love you.
That's what's so great. That's what's so great about all those songs. None of them are about love. All of them are actually the opposite. It's deep shit. It's Jim Steinman taking us operatically deep into the mind of a 16-year-old boy, into the front trousers of a 16-year-old boy. Come on, that's good stuff.
So I remember the Levi's. Can't you see my
You're
Levi's bursting at the seam? Anyways, we should get feedback from the listeners. This is what happens when the Montreal Canadiens, like there is nothing like in 3 minutes we can talk about.
Hey, did you see that thing behind me, by the way? Just FYI. That is the official program for the tribute to Pierre Trudeau at the 1984 Liberal Convention.
Tell the Paul Anka story. Come on.
Well, fucking Paul Anka, they had it. The tribute was so terrible. So terrible. They had brought back Rich Little to do impressions.
Oh, hello, Rochester.
Rich Little had not been in Canada for so long. This is 1984. I was 22. He was doing Pearson and Diefenbaker impersonations because he didn't know any more modern Canadians than that. Nobody knew what the fuck he was talking about.
Killer LaFontaine.
And then they bring on Paul Anka, who'd rewritten the words to My Way. And the whole thing was a travesty from start to finish, this song. And I remember all the words. And having only heard it once, it was so shocking. I still remember all the words. But the closer was this. Paul Anka says, no matter what, you must agree. Canada gave you him and it gave you me. So to one and all, from Pierre and Paul, we did it our way.
Beautiful. It's beautiful. It's like he had governed the country for 16 years also. Paul Anka. What could be schmaltzier than My Way with personalized lyrics? Just not enough cheese in the world.
So we have a lot to cover today. Maybe we should get to it.
All right.
Let's start with truckers and supply chains. Ever since the government, in a somewhat confusing fashion, announced that cross-border truck drivers would have to be vaccinated, this has been a firestorm. There's a truckers' convoy going to Ottawa, encouraged by some premiers. There's Twitter fights over what's on store shelves. There's a lot I don't understand about this, you two. First of all, I don't understand if the same law is in place in the United States. I don't know why this whole question isn't moot here in Canada. The second thing is, I don't understand why we're trying to control Omicron at the border. If our whole country's full of it, why do we care whether a truck driver has it when he or she crosses the border? So I don't understand any of that. But what I really don't understand are the main two parties on this question. The Liberals are denying supply chain issues when it's plainly obvious to everybody that they exist. And the Conservatives are allying themselves with a very marginal movement of unvaccinated truckers. And I say the Conservatives loosely, because while it's clear that many MPs support the truckers, O'Toole wouldn't say yes or no yesterday when asked repeatedly. So, what the fuck's going on here? You explain to me. What is going on?
Do you want to go first,
Jenni?
Scott, or
Go
do you
ahead.
want me to?
Jenni,
Well, I think this is more about. I think that probably this convoy or this movement started as kind of the truck drivers that were not vaccinated, which is apparently 10% of truckers in terms of this. But there were truckers on radio yesterday that I was listening to on talk radio that were like, "I'm vaccinated." This has actually now become more because of the Liberals' response, kind of their obtuse response in terms of supply chain issues and inflation and the high cost of and the increased high cost of living. This guy was like, listen, between the carbon tax and the next carbon tax coming up, between the increased price of gas generally and the green fuel standards, which is we're the only country in the world to have it. He goes, it is very hard for me to make a living. And so I think that this has become David, more than this is not the Liberals would like to make this an issue about whether truck drivers are vaccinated or not, but there is no way that there's, a convoy that's 70 kilometers long. It takes an hour. People that are on the roads, thousands of people are coming out and cheering these people on. This movement has raised $4.2 million in the last week through GoFundMe. To put that in perspective, the Liberal Party's fundraising numbers going into Q2 fundraising numbers, so going into essentially an election, into an election, were only $3.2 million. And so I think that this has become, and we'll see how the Conservatives handle it, but this is not an issue about vaccinations. This is not an issue about vaccinations. This is now becoming an issue about the fact that this federal government is making decisions that are causing people's standard of living to go down. It's making them uncomfortable. It's raising the price of everything. It's making things more expensive, and it's also crippling future generations in terms of the policies they're making. There's just almost no chance that anyone that doesn't own a house now, entry level house, like when our parents were, young, you got married, you bought a house, and you went on with life. People can't afford to do that now with the housing market, and so that's what I think this ultimately is. If I were the Liberals, I would stop being so flippant about what this issue is.
We're going to disagree about most of this. We're going to agree about the fact that the Liberals have, I think, been too sanguine on this issue of cost of living, too sanguine on the issue of shelves and supply chains. They've not, I don't think they've filled enough of the vacuum by saying, here's
supply chain, Scott, if I could just stop you for a second. Supply chain has entered the popular lexicon as a phrase. I hear it everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Everybody you talk to is talking about supply chains and stores, whatever. So
right. Yeah. So I think when you've got something that's, so we're all in agreement that I think that the government needs to be taking greater control of this narrative, talking about what that means, what that problem is, trying to define that problem. That's the first step in political communication, trying to actually say, this is what the challenge is. You can take me on that, but this is what the challenge is. Therefore, this is how we're approaching it. This is the plan. This is what we're doing. We don't hear any of this. There's a lot of kind of dismissive, kind of online bullshit stuff happening. And I think that we're probably all in agreement there. It's part of a broader piece about the degree of priority that this government pays to economic issues in total and how much it tries to put it at the center of its agenda. But we are going to disagree strenuously about this issue. It is the Conservatives, in my estimation, who have made this about vaccinations. And they've done it in the last 48 hours. And it's a dreadful mistake. And it's highly indicative of fundamental problems with the Conservative Party and the Conservative movement right now. And I say the Conservatives have made it about vaccinations because your buddy Pierre Poilievre is saying things like, let our truckers restore freedom for all. Let them drive and restore freedom for all. Melissa Landsman putting out stuff. My good friend, your good friend, putting out stuff about drop the mandate. They're making it about vaccinations. They're making it about freedom. It's a freedom rally, and it's freedom from being vaccinated, freedom from taking a miracle cure, freedom from not infecting people, freedom from not being beneath the ground in a pine box. It's bullshit. And this question of, then you get O'Toole, who won't even answer the question as to what his position is on it. He's so nutlessly shit-faced scared of a minority opinion even within his own party, much less the population. 66% of people say that we should be imposing harsher restrictions on the unvaccinated. I'm not necessarily in that camp, but that tells you where people are at. 85% of Canadians have had at least one dose. There is not a lot of tolerance. Both sides of the border require this rule. It is not an issue that you are on the majority of Canadians with. And so we can have an argument with supply chain, but that's not what the Conservatives are making this about. They're making this about freedom. They're making this about vaccination. They're making this about drop the mandate. They're making this about let people do what they want to do, particularly if that means not getting vaccinated. You can't have it both ways. The Conservative Party sucks and blows on this. It's why they lost the last election, and it's going to cripple them going forward.
No, this is if you see any of the commentary, this is mostly on supply chain stuff. And as for vaccine mandates, I actually don't support vaccine mandates as someone that's been fully vaccinated. Look at in Ontario. So you have a truck driver who sits by himself all day, driving across the province, but your kid is at school with teachers that aren't vaccinated.
Hey, we can get hard on that.
Jenny, help me with this. Jenny, help me with this. If the States requires it, why isn't our thing moot? Like, who cares? Like, if you are supposed to be crossing the border, you can't come into Canada without a vaccination. If we let you do that, you wouldn't be able to go back into the States without a vaccination. So why are people outraged at the Canadian government about this?
Well, I think that this started with them with truck drivers with truckers calling on the Canadian government to actually talk to the Americans about this. That's what I mean, David.
Okay.
This is not. This is why this issue has been. This is why this issue is. This is why this issue is much larger than what the media are trying to make it, and what the Liberal government is.
Then why are Conservative MPs going online and talking about freedom and mandates and vaccinations? Who the hell do you think is making it about this? Don't say it's the media. Don't say it's the world. The Conservatives are putting this in this kind of
I heard
culture
Andrew
war
Scheer
context.
was out hugging the
exactly.
The
Yeah, but thousands.
people.
But David, thousands of people were out. Thousands of people were out. Like this is thousands of people were out in Saskatchewan in extremely cold temperature to wave at these guys. Like this is.
Don't make the mistake of thinking that that's necessarily representative of majority opinion. It isn't majority opinion in the country. It's not majority opinion even within the Conservative movement.
Hey, Ignatieff had big crowds. Ignatieff had big crowds in 2011.
But that's what I'm saying to you, Scott, is that you can that this has become an organic issue about the fact of what I said, that this federal Liberal government continues to make tone deaf policies so they can do the Davos and COP circuit and seem really cool and fun, and all it's doing is causing extreme hardship for a lot of people in this country.
Actually, at some point,
okay, wait a second. Regardless of our opinions about whether or not they're. Go ahead, Scott. Go ahead.
Well, at some point, you're in government. You say it's a rule or it isn't. The United States has a rule. We have the rule. It's going to apply to everybody. Should we have an exemption? You make a decision. You say no. Then it's like, but the Conservative Party is pandering to the worst impulses, pretending that people who are vaccinated, members of parliament who are vaccinated, pretending that the problem here is that we're not letting a small minority of people, the 15% of people who still haven't even gotten one dose, we're not going to let them do whatever the hell they please.
Okay,
It's not about freedom. The freedom rally.
Then let's talk about Scott.
Fucking bullshit.
Last week, Hurly-Burleyites, I promised you a riveting story about megahertz, which is the way electromagnetic spectrum is measured. And I know what you're thinking. It's beyond my meager talents to make a thing like megahertz compelling. Well, I take that as a challenge, so listen closely. It's part of a larger story from our presenting sponsor, Telus, on how we get high-speed 5G wireless connectivity right across the whole of Canada, not just big cities, but all rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. Not just now, but for a generation. This is Chapter 2, the 100 megahertz mega-critical mega-decision. 100 megahertz is no arbitrary measure. It's the international standard for 5G mobile and wireless broadband, set by no lesser a body than the UN's International Telecommunications Union. Countries all over the world use that standard as they compete fiercely in the innovation economy. Countries that Canada can't afford to fall behind. 100 megahertz of mid-band spectrum would also allow carriers like Telus to deliver the maximum benefits of 5G to their customers. It's so much faster, with the ability to carry tons of data over really long distances. But here's where it gets even more important. With caps at 100 megahertz, 4 different carriers will have enough of that spectrum to launch their 5G networks equally in every market, which means they'll have to compete aggressively. So let's recap. 100 megahertz caps means fierce competition, fair prices. Canada keeps up with the rest of the world. I think that's pretty compelling stuff. As I speak these words, the feds are having public consultations on the best way to auction this 5G spectrum to carriers. They want optimal service for all Canadians. Telus wants that too. 100 megahertz caps just happens to be the key to getting there. We'll talk more about it next week, but in the meantime, you can have your say right now by going to telus.com/get5G right. Scott, can you answer my other question? Why do we care? Why do we care whether a trucker has COVID, has Omicron? Why do we care?
That's an interesting question, but that's not the same thing as, so that's vaccine mandates. Then the question is, how are we going to, do we say it's so prevalent all across North America that, these kinds of border restrictions don't make sense? But if you're going to do that, don't do it as an exemption for one small category of persons. Then say, what, that's the way it's got to roll overall. And that's kind of what we're starting to do in Ontario, if you want to be honest. Kids can go to school, right? Bar and restaurants are going to open. It's not because we're trying to stop the transmission anymore. We've given up on even measuring the transmission.
But Scott, I think so. Here is what I would say to the Liberals. they have to be intellectually honest. How about the thousands of public servants that work for them, that are paid for by the government, that are exempt from having to be vaccinated for their jobs?
If we're going to talk about intellectual honesty, for the love of Christ, we have to talk about members of parliament in the Conservative caucus.
Answer my question. Answer my question. Justin Trudeau talks about vaccine mandates.
There is a rule from Homeland Security in the United States.
You guys, can I ask a different question? I'd like to ask a different question. What do we make of O'Toole yesterday? Because we're talking about the Conservatives as if they're a monolithic thing here. And yes, there have been very prominent members of Parliament that have taken on this issue aggressively, but O'Toole refused to yesterday. What do we make of that?
Typical. Guy's too scared to say what he thinks, which I don't know. Does what he think? I presume that what he thinks is that, whenever he can, he tries to say, look, I want to get people vaccinated. Sounds like he's kind of secretly for vaccine mandates, but doesn't want to say it for fear that they will unleash even greater forces against him in his own caucus. He's got members of Parliament who aren't asking permission. They're moving ahead of where he is on it, so he can't afford to look like he's in contradiction to them. Otherwise, he'd have to impose discipline, and he's too scared to impose discipline. He doesn't have the capacity or the strength to impose discipline. So he just stands in front of the microphone and swings around like a weather vane and looks weak, which is only going to get him further pushed down the road.
Yeah, I think the problem yesterday is he went out with no message. So, I think it was Travis Stanraj from CBC that asked in the middle of the press conference. He's like, I'm a little bit confused here because you called a press conference to talk about this and now you won't answer any questions. Like that was how his kind of preamble to his question. And so this is like, I don't know what's going through their head in a morning meeting where they're like, okay, well, let's send the boss out to do a presser on this this big issue. Okay, what is he going to say?
Stand for something.
And but why go out? So if you're actually not going to give an answer one way or another, just don't go out. Like there was no need for him to go out. And it's funny. Yesterday's presser really set off a lot of people that I talked to internally and caucus. Like every day there's a drip of the caucus supporters that were like after the election, we're kind of like, we don't want another leadership race. Let's just give him the benefit of the doubt. This is all just very messy. And every day that he does something like yesterday, it drives more and more people into the category that they want to lead. They either want him gone or they want a leadership review, and they want a leadership review like now, as opposed to one in at the convention, which isn't scheduled for a year and a half. We saw the first riding association in Alberta, Foothills, that came out with a motion calling for, asking National Council for an immediate to call a leadership review question by June 13th, I think it is, of this year. And so every time he does something inconsistent, he is doing more and more harm to himself internally.
Well, for the sake of cursive politics, bring on a review. Come on. Give us a review.
Please give us a review. Well, nice, big, long, stretched out, ugly process. Multiple opportunities for people to stick a butter knife in. It's great.
No, but this is if we're going to like segue into like the conservative stuff, I think the only way Aaron survives kind of past the next very short term is if he actually concedes and calls for a leadership review.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. He's got to clear the air.
I think otherwise the next catalyst this week is going to be this election report, the James Cummings report. And they're really seeming to play it up. And they played it up, if you remember, back in the fall when they called it like, we're really taking this serious. We're really this is going to be good work. I've heard from people that half the interviews were done by, assistants that are being paid for by the party and not James himself. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but he's going into a caucus retreat with a caucus who is growing, who's becoming more hostile towards him. And they've already publicly said they're not going to release anything. If they basically stand up and say, oh, well, the leaders tour sucked here and, the ground game wasn't as good here and nothing else to see, I think that could be the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back.
Hey, Jenni, can I ask a question? You mentioned earlier, you're like, if he doesn't call the question, then, he's euchred. What, just like, so that means, like, in your opinion, does that mean like if he doesn't call the question himself by taking control of it, then what? At some point in the next 2-3 months, caucus just gets fed up. They just have a meeting and they say, "Listen, dude, here's your hat. fuck off.
Well, I think ultimately how it will come down would be you have enough caucus members who basically they stand up and say you either go or we have enough people to institute the Reform Act provision, and we're going to have a vote on your leadership. So you can either go slightly on your terms and try to save a little bit of dignity, or you can be the first leader in history to be taken out by an official vote in their caucus. But we've talked about this. We all know once you lose caucus, you are done. Like you can't, and it's usually a catalyst for like, it's something that triggers, you being pushed out that has nothing to do with why they're doing it. And that's what I think's gonna happen with him.
People have always wondered why Joe Clark didn't consider 66% at his party's review to be sufficient to stay on, and called the leadership convention for 83, which he lost. And I presume, Jenni, that his answer would be that it goes back to what you just said, that he couldn't control caucus with that mandate, and it was going to eat him slowly. And so he needed to actually win the leadership again, to have that affirmed in a more convincing way, to actually beat that beast within caucus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know that people ridiculed him for the decision, but I don't think 66% was sufficient. Like, you knew that you were just going to be bled. So, but ultimately,
anyways, I think we'll see. I just think I had a couple people, former colleagues that I used to work with, call me and just say, I don't understand. Like, this isn't I don't know what they're thinking. They're so so stupid in terms of what Aaron does. It's like, I don't know what they're thinking in terms of in decision-making, like how they sit down. Like, I don't know how you guys did it. We had a morning meeting in opposition and in government where you sit down and you hash out all these things. And you would never think of saying, okay, well, prime minister or leader, go out to a press conference. Don't worry. You'll be able to skate and not have to answer a question on this big issue. Like, I don't understand how that goes. Like, I don't understand if it's just two people making a decision and then they go out. I honestly just don't understand. I fundamentally don't get it, having been part of a lot of discussions that would have went into him going out to the press yesterday.
I do it with boxes.
Boxes are always the answer.
No, boxes aren't good for that, but.
So pretty soon, it'll be 2 years since we were all pulled into this whirlpool of a pandemic. 2 years. Remember the early scares, the toilet paper shortages, the sanitizer shortages, the job losses, the stock market crash and rebound back in early 2020? People had no idea where it was all heading. And some fears were justified. Turns out those overseas supply chains we rely on so heavily are pretty fragile. But within North America, the fuel and the minerals and the manufactured goods and grain and the livestock and groceries and all the other things upon which our way of life depends have kept moving. Even the cargo from abroad that does manage to make it to our seaports reaches stores and consumers in timely fashion. And no company is more vital to keeping our domestic supply chains flowing smoothly than our sponsor, CN. If you've got it, a train probably brought it. From day one of the pandemic, CN employees have been reporting for work and keeping our economy moving. During those long months when the US-Canada border was closed to most of us, CN trains kept rolling, and rolling on time, heading down through the American heartland to the Gulf of Mexico and back. They still are. Our weather is changing too, to put it mildly. Last winter was harsh, and we've already gone through a few tough months this winter. But CN knows how to deal with deep cold and ice. The C in CN does stand for Canadian. Last summer brought disastrous heat and wildfires. Scientists are predicting more in the year to come. Ultimately, though, CN's trains will run on time. They simply have to. We all have plenty to worry about nowadays. Life is getting more expensive. Everything is getting more complicated. We still don't know where the pandemic is going. But when we do get to the other side, it will be because CN's trains helped get us there. That you can count on. Okay, listen, let's get to our clipping of the day. We have a sound effect for this. Okay, our clipping of the day comes to us courtesy of Susan Delacourt and the Toronto Star. And she wrote a column on the weekend but very kindly picked up on a conversation that I had with Ellie Elmoim on the Herle Burley and made a nice shout out. So thank you, Susan, for that. Thank you for listening. Let me quote some excerpts from her column. Justin Trudeau made it through an entire news conference on Friday without saying his government had Canadians' backs. This is progress. On Wednesday, the Prime Minister said that line about having Canadians' backs no fewer than 5 times in a press conference that lasted under an hour. I joked on Twitter that there should be some kind of system at news conferences that would make lights flash every time a politician used a canned phrase to understand that we'd reached the marketing portion of the event. Repetition of catchphrases and slogans, of course, is classic branding behavior. Still, I wonder whether the pandemic is going to force a rewrite of the communications playbook. It isn't just the media doggedly following those news conferences, but members of the public too, captive at home and looking for information, not slogans, from their leaders. Scott, I had this conversation with Ellie on the podcast. The government talks only in talking points that are not made of English and don't really address what's on people's minds. Is that effective? I mean, they're in office for 6 years, so is it effective and is it working? Or so it grates me.
I'll throw out a couple thoughts to kick this off. First, just to take because strengths are weaknesses, weaknesses are strengths, and nothing, all things are gray, not many things are black and white. And so I do think it's important to say that there is an important point to be made about coherence and clarity and consistency in politics and political communication. So we've got your backs by dint of the policies that you take, the actions people witness from you, the things you say, the pictures you provide, all those things. You want to be reinforcing that. You want coherence and clarity. And I think at the very highest possible level, this government, the Trudeau enterprise has always really understood that iconography of that stuff, and they've done it well. The challenge is that they overdo it. And often their rhetoric is ahead of the reality of what they deliver. And sometimes it gets flat out cartoonish. I always say to people when I do media training, when you ask people what they think good communication is, they'll invariably go, oh, well, I know what good communication is. That's when you say Coke adds life, and you say it 100 times and people hear it once, and you say it 1,000 times and you hear it 10 times. And I always say, no, that's wrong. That's marketing. That's branding. That's media. That's not media. Because we all hate the person who's in an interview whose answer is Coke adds life to everything. You say that person is just a corporate avatar. They're just repeating what they were told. Therefore, they have no inherent point of view, nothing original or spontaneous or organic about them. And therefore, I refuse to defer to them, and I'm not listening to this interview anymore. Media isn't marketing. Media and political communication is the act of persuasion. You must back up your points. You must find ways to be repetitive without repeating yourself and reinforce without being repetitive. And I thought that Susan's piece was downright precognitive because as it had been written and filed, a day later, we see members of the Trudeau cabinet holding up these signs. Stand with Ukraine, hashtag stand with Ukraine. And I got to tell you, it fucking boils my ass. It is. And lots of people have made this comment, so this is not original for me. But to me, it's the epitome of, horseshit hashtag politics, right? It's just like Instagramming your way to a foreign policy. No. And I don't know the full ambit of what exactly the government's doing. Conversations are happening with NATO partners. Conversations are happening with the United States with respect to Ukraine. But I do know that the impression of an unbelievably superficial treatment of an unbelievably serious issue is left with people when you have cabinet ministers standing like goddamn marionettes with this stupid hashtag sign. It's like, unless that is, first of all, I don't want it at all. But at minimum, it must be reinforced by consistent, clear positions you're taking that demonstrate where you stand. I don't even know where we're at on Ukraine, what we're doing on Ukraine, and to have this goddamn hashtag. So anyway, I'll shut up now, but the whole thing just drives me mental. It's a real vulnerability for the government.
I agree with you. I thought they all looked, and the cabinet ministers, the cabinet ministers especially, were just I enjoyed.
They're in the cabinet, Jenny. They don't need to hold up a sign. If you stand with Ukraine, go tell the fucking prime minister.
Exactly.
You're in the cabinet.
No, but
tell people.
But this is it. You say, Scott, there's meetings going on with the U.S. and others.
I hope there is. I don't know.
Are we part of them? Because 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting with Biden called with the U.K., Australia, New Zealand, I think it was, and someone else. It was almost like we were kicked out of the Five Eyes. And then all of a sudden, yesterday, he has a call with the European Union. They haven't had a G7 meeting on this. So you love your G20. Fuck, we don't even have the G7 anymore, it seems. Like Biden has just decided to completely go around. Like I was in the Prime Minister's office when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we played a very, very forceful role in terms of aid and military support to Ukraine. We were the ones that pushed. Merkel was technically the senior statesperson, but Russia, of course, Germany has a much more dependent relationship because 30% of their, at least now, might have been more before, of their natural gas comes from Russia. And I know that like we were in emergency cabinet meetings. We were in briefings with Obama all the time, and the rest of the G7 leaders. Harper 4 days before Russia actually invaded Crimea, 2 of the airstrips. Harper was like walking around with the new prime minister of Ukraine in the Independence Square, so then he could push the G7 leader or the rest of the G8, the 7, that they were going to kick Russia out, and they were going to move the G8 out of Sochi to Brussels. So, and we've seen Melanie Joly go. She did one photo op where she kneeled in front of pictures of people that had died, which I can tell you, I spoke with some of my Ukrainian friends, and that disgusted them. And then pictures of her with Canadian soldiers seemingly doing nothing, and apparently had a pro forma meeting with the deputy prime minister where he asked for further military support, and she said, "I'm going to have to get back to you," which is that's a sweet fuck no. And so I just think there's such vast differences between how this government is handling a major crisis and what I was proud to be part of in 2014. And I couldn't imagine, I couldn't imagine walking into the prime minister's office and going, "We've asked John Baird and Peter MacKay to hold up a sign that says we support Ukraine." Harper would have said, "Have you lost your fucking mind?" Like I would have left the room and he would have said, I think someone needs to check on Jenni because there's something wrong with her.
Sorry, I just want to underline that. That's exactly where my brain went. Having been in the PMO, I'm more generous than you are. I'm hoping and assuming that there's acres of activity going on behind the scenes, and there's all sorts of discussions going on. And I'm just from my own time in PMO, I know how much the energy and the machinery of government starts getting behind something like this. So I'm inclined to be a little more generous. But we see no evidence of it. And as you say, I couldn't help but think to myself, I was a comms director. If I'd walked in to the prime minister's office, we do the morning meeting with the clerk, and Tim and me are sitting there at 8:15 in the morning. And I'm like, where are we at on Ukraine? Blah, 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 this meeting, that's going to have these phone calls. We talked to the deputy prime minister in Ukraine. And Scott, where are we at on the comms of it? Well, prime minister, I got a color printer, and I'm gonna do 28 sheets of paper, and I'm going to ask everybody to hold it up mutely on Instagram. I think he would have said, like, please leave the office, drop your badge at the door, don't come back. I need someone with a brain.
But Scott, so
it's so performative. It's so performative, and it's so out of sync with. Go ahead, Jenni.
I was just going to say, if I could say one thing, this is more policy substantive, but it is comms related. If there was more going on behind the scene, would they not sometime in the last 5 days have said that? Because they're getting mocked and ridiculed. And it's even getting like, people are making fun of it. Like someone sent me, I think it was a CNN article. Would you not, like, if you were actually like doing something more substantive, would you not be pushing that out? Like I would be like, okay, we embarrassed ourselves. Let's say like Biden did
they did say Julie was at Ukraine. I mean, the other thing I think is that this is Biden's play. So, I mean,
but the trip to Ukraine by Joly, that's performative too. Like Jenni's right. There's no substance to our policy that can be discerned at the moment.
Well, there was no output, right? So that's
right. So all we see is the performative aspects, and that's when they get in trouble. Is to when they get their comms like this way out of sync with what they're actually doing, and it looks ridiculous.
Well, you don't want people to see behind the screen, and so I mean the imagery of this stuff of communication, it's important. It does matter, and they've demonstrated that it matters. but it only works to the extent to which if people think, well, that's all there is, and I see behind this, I can see the gears at work, and this is just hashtag horseshit, then you failed.
All right.
It was angering, man. Like, God.
Susan, you touched a nerve.
Help me.
Touched a nerve here on the Curse of Politics with a very timely column. Okay, so we touched on this earlier. This week, the Conservative caucus is going to receive the Cummings report.
Well, we don't know what the Conservative caucus is. We just know the Cummings report is. He has indicated in the past that they're not good. That he is not, like, it is not to be made public or what have you. So this is why it's going into the next 2 days is going to be very interesting, because how can you have a report to save your leadership if there going to be a synopsis like, Bob Smith, who ran the Lethbridge campaign, thinks Aaron's a great guy and he should keep doing what he's doing. And so we don't know. We actually have no idea. I've had people ask me, I'm like, fucked if I know.
I've conducted a review and things are in order. Nothing to see here.
It's great. I'm going to deliver it with cupcakes.
It'll be like Baghdad Ali the communications Bob from the Iraq War. The tanks are not in Baghdad, as you see, like the leopards like rolling like behind him.
How can you have a report? How can you commission a report and use it as a piece of process to manage your way through the tough time, and then say, I'm not releasing it? Like, something's got to come out. There has to be an output.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I'm just saying what he said. I'm just saying what they have said. His people have said publicly numerous times.
Jesus. Okay, so let's help them.
Yeah.
Let's help them. I presume the Cummings report is bullshit anyway. So, fuck the Cummings report. Here's the Curse of Politics report. The Curse of Politics report on the Conservative campaign. I want to divide it up into two categories: strategy and tactics and execution. So I'll start. Strategy. The notion to appear unthreatening and to offer incremental rather than revolutionary change was correct and gave the party a chance to win off the top. However, the strategy took carbon pricing off the table for discussion, which was a mistake, and it did not have a second act for the campaign. It needed a major policy to anchor the support gained in the first 2 weeks. And the strategy was hampered by the fact that the party was not bought in. It was too abrupt a shift from his leadership campaign, and there was not enough advance work to ensure caucus and party would go along. From Herle, the Conservative strategy gets a C.
Oh, we have to grade it?
Jesus, you didn't tell us any of this, David. We're unprepared for our own podcast. Holy moly. You're asking me to grade a paper right here live on the internet.
Well, I actually have to say, I don't have a lot of disagreement. Like, I don't have a lot of, I don't have a lot of disagreement. I thought the carbon pricing, carbon tax issue was a huge mistake that they had. There's still lots of public polling out. I was reading today, polling from a actually pro-environmental group that were complaining about the fact that a carbon tax is still not something that most people support. There's a reason the Democrats won't bring it in. There's a reason Obama didn't bring it in. He did studies in the early 2010s, and the reason it's not part of Biden's climate change plan. So there's a reason there that they didn't do that. And I think it went to your tactics. I think the not being to pick up to the not being scary or what have you. I probably disagree with you on that, but I think what he ended up doing then is he hugged himself so close to Trudeau and the Liberals, or had no position on something, and then focused on kind of like what he thought was the warm and cuddly issues. Like, he thought, putting on a pair of Vans running shoes and running every day, like basically forcing almost at gunpoint candidates to like run with him every morning so they could tweet it out. I think it was a mistake, because it's not just, I actually disagree with you in terms of not having the caucus or the caucus on side. Caucus was actually willing to go along with the election, if you remember. I think he offered nothing to Canadians in 905 ridings. Like, it's not that long ago that Conservatives provincially are still leading in the public polls with Doug. We cleaned up the 905. There's only one seat in the I'm not doing the Niagara Region 905, but the GTA 905 in the 2011 election that we didn't win. So it's not just they made a play. They miscalculated what the suburban soccer mom or what have you, where their head was at. And they thought it was all personality, and you're never going to be able to be a candidate like Justin Trudeau in any way if you're trying to turn it into like who's cooler.
Okay. So we're grading on strategy right now. Is that right, Dave? That's how you're sort of setting aside. So I would trying to take advantage of the fact that you two were talking to try to organize my thoughts here. I would say, first, I would give them, if I was doing the report, I'd say, look, the idea of introducing the platform in full on the second day of the campaign, good piece of strategy. Good piece of strategy because it gave you something to talk about. It anticipated correctly that the Liberals would just try to drift on their record, and maybe that would give you more definition, reportable news. And also that it allowed you to present yourself as someone that was in the mainstream of political and popular opinion on most issues. So it was a good piece of strategy, and it created a tremendous amount of opportunity, probably grew the pool of voters available to you pretty quickly in the campaign. So that was good. Second, carbon pricing, like you guys both said, right? Probably missed an opportunity there. Strategically, focused too much on diminishing the risk of fighting on climate change, and therefore robbed yourself of the opportunity to fight on pricing, make that a kitchen table issue, and differentiate yourself. So you probably were too risk averse there, and you abandoned an opportunity to have differentiation. The third, and perhaps most importantly, and why you end up getting a shitty grade from me, is that you failed to reconcile yourself to the most prevalent issue on the minds of people. Vaccines, where you stand on them, not wishy-washy, not trying to have it both ways. This is an issue where they've had to live with it for a long time. It's the number one issue on people's minds. It's what moves them around day by day. Absolute clarity from the Liberals, whether you agree or disagree. No clarity at all from the Conservatives. Look like you're trying to have it both ways. Look like you've got a political problem that you're trying to balance in public, which is always a bad look for a leader. And the lack of clarity and coherence on that issue ended up becoming an anchor that sank you in the last half of the campaign. And not anticipating that and not having the courage to confront that and hoping that somehow the campaign would rob you of the need to address it was poor strategic planning, and therefore I'm giving you a D.
Let's see if the Cummings report is that tough. All right.
It will be.
Tactics and execution.
Can you go first, David, so I know exactly what you're talking about?
Right. Walking into the fight over gun control was itself a fatal mistake in platform development. The studio was an interesting innovation, but they should have realized when everybody was tired of it and it had become sterile. There were relatively few candidate problems. The advertising went over the top and lost credibility. It appealed to people who already hated Trudeau as much as the O'Toole campaign did, and not the people they needed to reach. On balance, I give tactics and execution a C-.
Yeah, I would say actually I agree with you. There was very few candidate eruptions. We've still, that's one thing that is held over from the Harper years. We still are a pretty disciplined organization in terms of on the ground campaigns. I agree with you regarding the studio. I think that it was an interesting tactic. I don't blame them for wanting to have that ready, considering we're still in the cycle of opening up, closing down, opening up, closing down. But I do think they overused it, and I'm not sure they used it effectively. Like I am not a huge fan of telephone town halls in terms of a tactic. I think, don't get me wrong, I've used them, and there are times you can use them, but it has to be it has to be, I think, a unique issue or what have you. Like I remember in the 2011 campaign, basically having people in the war room call in to write questions because we didn't have enough people that were willing to put up their hands when we were doing kind of a last swing in the lead up to the end. And so I think that it was a good tactic to have. It was a good thing to have. They just overused it, to your point. I think also from just from an on the ground point of view. I think our data was pretty stale going into the election. I think if I had been them, I would have spent more money in terms of trying to clean that up. They didn't have a lot of time, but they did have a year. And so if I had been them, I would have cleaned it up and I would have centralized it a bit more. I don't know how you guys ran things, but we centralized working with local campaigns. We had a very big unit who had very different jobs in terms of working with local EDAs. So I would have probably done that. I also think, and I'm not sure this was a campaign decision, but you have to think that it is, because Waleed was the campaign chair. I think that it did Aaron a lot of harm, and I think it was very probably demoralizing when the last 5 or 6 hours he came out publicly and said that we didn't think we had a chance of winning, and there is 6 hours before the polls close is that's when you're scraping to pull out every vote. So I think that was a tactical error as well.
Man, in an election in which you're only down by 1 or 2%, it's an interesting tactic.
Well, and they ended up winning. It's kind of like the Leger poll out. I saw someone tweet today and say the Conservatives are within striking distance. Well, we're 3 points behind what we got in the last election. Trudeau's up once. The horse race numbers just seem so useless. I don't even know why we get so hung up on them, because they've just been so wrong in the last 2 elections.
Well, not only that,
and the national numbers have become even less. National numbers have become even less useful. Yeah.
Yeah, those are the national numbers. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're not telling you a story of advantage. They're telling you a story of dismalness across the spectrum. I mean, it's an ongoing concern for me that the Liberal Party can't, can be comforted by just sort of hovering at 32%. That's an unacceptable standard. I'd be spending all my energies trying to increase that number. But look, on tactics, I'll try to go quickly. I think I would give them reasonably high marks on a bunch of prep stuff, on a bunch of making sure that there was a system in place, command and control, as you guys have mentioned, not have a bunch of candidate eruptions. That should have happened with this caucus and all the tensions that exist, and it didn't. So that's an impressive thing. People don't think about it, but, it's harder to pull off than you expect. They seem to have a bunch of structures and people in place that seem to work well. The campaign was a functioning unit. But there's 2 big fails when it came to tactics. One was the gun control issue. If you're going to put that thing in there, then you have to have a point of view about what you're going to do if it blows up in your face. You had to anticipate the possibility it would. And at minimum, you've got to be in a position where you can't permit that to be a 5-day story. I mean, it's just the fundamental rule of elections. You got 36 days. Each one of them is gold. You can't piss 5 of them away in the middle of the campaign, or you're not going to like how the campaign ends. So that, turning a 1 or 2 day problem, you're going to have a problem during the campaign. You must have problems during campaigns. This always happens. And the trick is to make it a 1 or 2 day problem, not a 5-day problem. And that's a giant fail. And that's all based on decisions and inaction and poor decision making and poor actions. The final thing, I think, we're kind of saying the same thing, but I would make a different point about the studio. Set the studio aside. I think there was any more fundamental error. The studio became an element of it. And that was mid-campaign, you had momentum. But if you're going to have momentum, you need to demonstrate you have momentum. And I thought that the tour failed to support the arc of the campaign. They should have had O'Toole surrounded by people. At that point, as polls were kicking in and people were seeing that he had a lead, people started contemplating whether or not they could have him. They should have had him in physical settings, surrounded by people who were excited by him, who were pleased to see him. That would have made him inviting. That would have reinforced that he was saleable to the broad public who didn't know him yet. And they didn't do that, and sticking you on a goddamn telephone in a studio. So it's not so much the studio that's the problem. It's the inability to identify, we need to create a momentum storyline here. And I think that was a big tactical error. I think the world could have gone differently for them if they had had him out on the hustings with real people going, holy smokes, this guy's kind of lighting it up. You can create your own luck in those situations. You can create your own sort of momentum and magic. We saw Trudeau do it in 2015. We've seen other campaigns do it. And they almost seemed like they were indifferent to that possibility. And that's something that when you get a bit of a lead, you want the world to see it and think it and feel it and extend it.
Yeah. Good points, good analysis. That gun control thing, I mean, when things happen in campaigns that look inexplicable, there's generally a reason. So I accept the prospect that there's some reason I haven't contemplated. But to put something provocative in a platform, and your fallback strategy is, if somebody notices this, we'll just retract it. That's bonkers. Anyway, okay. Mr. Pinsent, it's time for the Hayus.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hayus are about to begin.
All right, I'll go first this week. My Hayu goes out to Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan. I smell a scandal. Already your approval rating plummeting due to your COVID handling. Now there's a report from the University of Toronto that says that Saskatchewan has underreported its COVID deaths by 7 times. 7 times. So I think that Mr. Scott Moe, I think you're going to test the theory that the Sask party is unbeatable, because I think this thing has legs. Okay, you guys got a Hayu?
My Hayu is actually going to be something we already touched on. I'm going back to Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland and the Liberal government. It's evidence. I'm hoping maybe Trudeau's tone deaf on this, but hopefully others are not. That we do actually have an issue. People are struggling to pay for things, and there is massive tax increases happening this year. Between, as I said, we've talked about the green fuel standards, which will hit people. You've got the carbon tax, and it's going to be increased further on April the 1st, and then you have EI and CPP premium increases, which could cause, like CPP ones it's a big hit on people's paychecks. It could be $1,500 for kind of an average family. And so I would call out to them that in a budget or when they're sitting around the cabinet table is to actually see what Canadians are saying, and they may want to put off, or they should scrap doing some of the tax increases that they have announced that they plan on doing this year.
Excellent. Scott?
Okay. My Hayu goes out to the federal government and the provinces together, but particularly I think for the federal government, because this program and initiative that I'm about to speak about is really anchored in the federal Liberal program. And it seems like we are about to conclude childcare agreements with every single jurisdiction in the country. So we got Nunavut the other day. There's a front page story in the Star that Ontario is on the brink of signing. Let's assume and hope that that's true. And so my Hayu is, okay, guys, that's great. We've gotten signatures in place. We're going to get framework agreements in every place. Now's the time to demonstrate that that wasn't the ambition. Right? That the ambition is to actually create spaces. And I want to be really, really, really precise about this. The great failing of childcare policies and childcare support policies for the last 20 years has been the failure to incentivize and create spaces. Good, safe, regulated spaces where a child can go, be safe, learn, and prosper. That's what we need. And we don't have those spaces. And I hope that this agreement doesn't become just a big fancy framework for income transfer to provinces and to people through the tax system. That's been the problem. We contented ourselves for 20 years to say, you know what, if we just use the tax system to send more money to parents, then that's going to do the trick. And it has not done the trick because it does not create spaces. Spaces, spaces, spaces. Once the signatures are done in Ontario, and we've got it all across the country, I want to see spaces created. I want to see reporting on the spaces. I want to hear from governments that the spaces they exist. I want to see them being filled. Because without spaces, this whole thing is just shit.
All right. Hayus, hot Hayus today. Hot Hayus today. Thank you, the two of you, for joining me on my Happy Good Mood Day and for being part of my Happy Good Mood Day. By the way, you know, we talking about music at the beginning. Is this not one, Supertramp, one of the underrated bands of the 70s, for sure?
Absolutely.
Nobody talks about them anymore. They got 4 albums in the 70s, Crime of the Century, Crisis, What Crisis, Even in the Quietest Moments, and Breakfast in America, that are among the best albums of that era. Superb. And I hope that Roger Hodgson gets as much love as Meatloaf when he kicks off.
It boggles my mind that you could like Supertramp so emphatically and in the same breath dismiss Meatloaf. There's a little bit of mixed DNA there. Oh,
no,
man.
there isn't.
Loud theatrical musicality, lots of different stuff. Come on.
All right, guys. Let's thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsor, CN Rail. Let's thank our Herle Burleyites for listening, our accursed for listening to our show today.
More comments on Apple Podcasts. I keep checking it. I want more. I want the love.
There is no love anymore. We're dead on Apple Podcasts. Nobody wants to go there and rate and review us anymore.
Come on.
No,
I'm
it's over.
begging
I've been
you.
begging. I've been begging and people won't do it.
Throw us a line.
Show us some love. We're dying out here. All right, folks. Have a great week. Jenni, don't get too much sun. We'll see you all next Tuesday. Take care.